Hey, it's Tim from TimSteppingOut.com. Today I wanted to talk about how Jesus actually got invented. Why it's so certain in my mind that Jesus did not exist. I tried to get to it in my last video, but I just couldn't get to the point. So this video is going to be dedicated to that. So just to give a recap of my last video, I think Christianity was preceded by the Nazarenes. They were a Jewish group who believed that Scripture, particularly Moses' writings, had been corrupted after the Deuteronomic reform, which King Josiah in the 7th century BCE, who after locating the long-lost Book of the Law, which was a Moses forgery, Josiah proceeded to get all the idols and references to the Queen of Heaven out of the temple. A couple decades later, the city's sacked, the temple's destroyed. Jews are scattered across the diaspora after being expelled from Judea. It's a big mess, but a new orthodoxy had been born. Yet there were still existing groups, little pockets of groups who continued to burn incense for the Queen of Heaven, as found in Jeremiah 44:18. This movement continued to exist throughout the diaspora and even in Judea, undergoing evolution over the course of hundreds of years. The Nazarenes had celestial spirits, which were near earth. They were 96 miles tall. There was the feminine spirit, who was the spirit which underlied the Queen of Heaven and would reside in the city, in Jerusalem, whether it be the New Jerusalem or the original one. There was also the male spirit, also 96 miles tall in the sky, and he represented the spirit of the temple and had another manifestation as the son of the Queen of Heaven. This idea eventually gets merged with the Jewish idea of the Messiah, and that is who Jesus Christ would have been recognized originally as. That was sort of the idea underlying Jesus Christ, whether he be real or just a metaphor or an allegory. But I think that he started out as a metaphor. Jesus is called a Nazarene. He says he's said to be from Nazareth. This is just a translation issue. This is just a screw up of the Hebrew term for Nazar as represented in the Greek language. It became Nazareth. They're the same thing. Nazareth, of course, didn't exist, wasn't so called at the time. I mean, you've got this geographic space around Galilee where Nazareth is now, but I mean, it wasn't so called then. I mean, it probably wasn't even inhabited, and even if it was, this guy probably didn't live there. These ideas percolated for hundreds of years until we get increasingly robust power grabs in increasingly complex social and political atmospheres. There were two particular leaders who I speculate were not only Nazar, but who underlied the gospel character Jesus. They were Theudas and the Egyptian. Cuspius Fadus became the procurator of Judea in the year 44. One of the first things he had to deal with was a John the Baptist type Messiah person named Theudas. Theudas was a spiritual leader. He was bringing his people down to the Jordan River. He claimed he could part the river. He was probably doing some kind of magic trick where he had someone else maybe putting in some kind of makeshift dam or something like that, maybe taking advantage of a dry season or something like that. That's just my speculation, but that's what I think was going on. Because if you're saying you can part the river, the Jordan River, you better be able to do something to impress the people, otherwise they're going to yawn and go home. Josephus doesn't give a lot of insight, and really the only useful information you can get about Theodos is from Josephus, although he's mentioned in Acts of the Apostles as well, and he's mentioned by Clement of Alexandria in the late 2nd century. He must have been important. He must have been a pretty serious problem, because you don't send a band of soldiers to kill a bunch of people and to behead a leader unless there's a reason for it. Because why waste that energy? Why risk troops? Why risk backlash unless there's something to be gained? There's some reason for it. So some of Theodos's followers were banished, including an Eleazar, who shows up later. In terms of why Theodos was a problem, why Theodos had to kill him, my speculation is because he was pissing off the Sadducees. There was a mutual symbiosis between the Sadducees and the procurator. Any enemy of the Sadducees is most certainly an enemy of the procurator. Why? Because the Sadducees controlled the temple politics, which means that they controlled the movement of information, the movement of sentiment, and they had enough influence within the culture so that a symbiosis is going to occur. They were criticized by everyone for being too Rome-friendly. And of course they were, because there was a benefit to be had there. You start pissing off Rome, you start pissing off the procurator, you're going to lose your power. And the Sadducees knew this, and so they didn't piss off the procurator for the most part. A couple decades later, you get a Sadducee who does start pissing off the procurator. His name was Hanan ben Hanan. And it pisses off the procurator enough, who had just been appointed. It was Albinus who had just been appointed, because Hanan had called the Sanhedrin. You can't call the Sanhedrin without the procurator there. It really upset Jerusalem citizens, because he killed James, who must have also been a leader, who I think was probably the James underlying all these early Christian references to James, who I also think is a Nazarene. What I think is happening there is that Theodos was telling his followers that the Sadducees were corrupting the Scripture. The Sadducees were advancing, along with the scribes, they were advancing a Scripture which had corrupted Moses' writings, right? Which would mean that Theodos was a Nazarene too. And that's what I think was going on. And I think that it was pissing off the Sadducees, and therefore, also becoming fodder for an uprising, because along with just giving away their motherland to Rome, the Sadducees are also responsible for violating the real religion. And I think that was the sentiment of Theodos and his followers, and I think that that's why Theodos had to kill him. There was one follower of Theodos named Eleazar who wasn't killed, but he was banished. He was sent off to the mountains, presumably outside of Jerusalem. For a time, evidently, according to Josephus, things are okay, things are fine. But what ends up happening is that the Galileans, right, people around Galilee, are making their regular trips into Jerusalem to celebrate the festivals in Jerusalem. And they start getting attacked by Samaritans. And they're getting their stuff stolen, they're probably having people killed. And so they go to the new procurator at the time, and the procurator says, "Buzz off, I don't care about this." Josephus speculates that it's because the Samaritans had paid off the procurator at the time, the Judean procurator at the time, that's why he turned a blind eye to the Samaritans attacking the Galileans. So the Galileans decide to fight back. They recruit, evidently, this Eleazar, who was a follower of Theodos, And they start fighting back. The specifics of what they did is not really clear, but they probably, fought, maybe killed some Samaritans, and they were put on trial for it, and some of these Galileans were crucified for fighting back against the Samaritans. Needless to say, you can see a real reason for Jewish resentment of the Samaritans. What followed after these crucifixions was an increasingly volatile situation where people around Galilee, people around Jerusalem, are starting to fight back a little more. And by this time, we're in maybe the early to mid-50s. So there's less than 2 decades before, actually more like a decade before the wars start, and then by 70 you've got the temple destroyed. This eventually gives rise to the Egyptian. The Egyptian took his followers to the Mount of Olives. He claimed he could knock down the temple walls with his words. This is obviously Jesus Christ. And the problem is he's 20 some years too late, right? But this is the person who I think is influencing who is, I think, the primary influence on the character Jesus Christ. So remember, now we've got a direct link between this Egyptian, who is Jesus, and Theodos, who is John the Baptist, who's obviously John the Baptist. And what I think is happening here is you've got legend building around these people who I think are the Nasar. They are the Nazarenes. So what happens to the Egyptian? He gets maybe 5,000 followers, and they go out to the wilderness, and they wage some sort of revolt. Rome steps in, quells the uprising, and the Egyptian escapes and is evidently never heard from again. This is the stuff of legend. This is the stuff that a pre-existing Nazarene movement is going to build into something much bigger and much more interesting than simply this guy running away. What I think is also simultaneously going on is that you've got different factions. This James faction, who, by the way, James is not dead yet, because James dies in the 60s when he's killed by Albinus. And then you've got this Egyptian, this person from out of town, from evidently Egypt, who is at his root a Nasar, but he's an Egyptian-influenced Nasar, not a Jerusalem Nasar, right? And so you've got leaders who are in conflict within this Nazarene community. And of course, I think that this gives rise to this Paul-James dichotomy that we see throughout the New Testament. It's very interesting that in Acts 21, Paul gets arrested, and he says to a Roman commander, "Can I speak?" Right? And by the way, this is the same time frame. This is in the 50s. This is no coincidence that Acts is written about this. The writer of Acts was familiar with this history, and he knew what was going on here. He knew the real history, and he knew the pretend history that they were building to create a legend. And I don't mean to paint it as just a sort of conspiracy, but it was a little bit. So Paul asks the Roman commander if he can speak to the people. The Roman commander says, "Aren't you the Egyptian who took a bunch of people out to the wilderness and caused a bunch of trouble?" What does Paul say? He says, "I'm Paul, a Jew from Tarsus." Right? This strikes me as a very, very passive-aggressive attack on Paul by the writer of Acts. Acts is begrudgingly admitting Paul into the orthodoxy. The Acts writer hates Paul. He associates him with Simon the magician. He is stripping attributes from Paul and giving them to Peter, as is the case in Acts 11, where it's Peter who goes to the uncircumcised, right? He steals that from Paul and gives it to Peter. Clearly there's an agenda, but there's a begrudging admission of Paul into the orthodoxy, and that's the purpose of Acts. One of them, anyway. It's no coincidence that Clement of Alexandria mentions Theodos in the same sentence as he mentions Paul. He says that Paul teaches Theodos, who taught Valentinus, right? In the same paragraph, Clement is tripping all over himself in terms of chronology. He says that Marcion precedes Simon, who learned from Peter, right? Marcion didn't precede Simon. I mean, how could he? And of course, you can come up with various stories about why this is, but what I think is happening here is that Clement is just creating errors all over the place. He certainly creates an error in terms of the chronology of Marcion, who, by all accounts, seems to be somewhere in the 2nd century, whereas Simon Magus is clearly put in the 1st century. What's happening is that it's a simple error in chronology. And one of the errors, another error that Clement creates, is that it's not Paul who taught Theodos, it's Theodos who taught Paul, because Theodos is John the Baptist, but Clement is screwing up the chronology in this paragraph. And when you fix this, when you fix his chronology, it all starts to make sense, right? You've got Theodos, who's John the Baptist, and you've got the Egyptian, who's Jesus. And these people had some dramatic license applied to them, and they became the gospel characters. Consider the Mandeans. We don't know much about the Mandeans, but we do know that the initiated Mandeans are called the Nazarai. This is no coincidence. It's because the Nazarenes from the 1st and 2nd century are kind of the same people as the people who became the modern day Mandeans, except the Mandeans revere John the Baptist instead of Jesus. They actually look down on Jesus and call Jesus a liar. It's easy to draw a line between these two, especially if you speculate that Theodos and John the Baptist are the same. There's a line between Theodos and the Egyptian via this Eleazar, who helped the Galileans after or prior to them being crucified for fighting back against the Samaritans. Remember who Irenaeus said were copious consumers of the Gospel of John. It was the Valentinians. But who did Valentinus learn from? Well, if you consider again that Clement of Alexandria quote, it was Theodos or Paul, if you take my interpretation from it. So Valentinus was a disciple of Paul, who was a disciple of Theodos. The line here is very clear, very obvious, and very analogous to what modern consensus presumes, is that Jesus followed John the Baptist, right? Well, yeah, Paul followed Theodos. New Testament scholarship has a real problem around the Gospel of John. Why is it so different than the Synoptic Gospels? A reasonable person might presume, well, it's just people making stuff up, and I think that was part of it, but I think that there's obviously more nuance around it than that. There was probably a schism between groups who elevated different leaders and thought that those leaders' attributes should flow over to Jesus. Remember, Paul says, you people think that there are other Jesuses. You people put up with that easily enough. Well, what's he talking about there? I think he's talking about this particular process, that attributes of particular leaders are being applied to Jesus. And he recognizes, and I think that he accepts that that is the truth, but he doesn't like it that it's people other than him and his attributes that are being applied to Jesus. I think he was perfectly aware. It's a very cynical interpretation of Paul, or it's certainly cynical on my part, but I think that it makes Paul very cynical as well. But I mean, consider all these things. You've got Marcus the magician who is turning water into wine. Right? I mean, that's very interesting that Irenaeus is so hostile to that practice, despite the fact that that's Jesus' first miracle in the Gospel of John 2. Irenaeus even references that miracle, presumably. I mean, he references the wedding at Cana anyway, when he's talking about how Jesus must have been 50 years old when he died, or thereabouts. But you also have the virgin birth, which, I mean, by all accounts, the majority of Christians must have rejected. I mean, you've got Cerinthus and the Ebionites and Carpocrates all rejecting the virgin birth, and yet it makes it into the orthodoxy. Well, look at the Gospel of Thomas. When you find one who's not born of a woman, fall down on your face and worship him, because that's your father. Well, what's Paul saying? All the time. He's talking about his birth, the pains of his childbirth all the time. He's talking about that he was born of a miscarriage, of an ectroma. Well, that ectroma is his claim that he was not born of a woman. Right? It also means he's an outsider. He's not anywhere near where he's from. That must be, because if you know his parents, then you could just ask, hey, was Paul born from a miscarriage? I presume he wasn't. I mean, maybe he was. That kind of violates how I think the world works. There are attributes about Jesus that are being built from, I think, leaders in these Nazarene communities. But the idea is that the people who have these attributes are the paraclete. They are the encapsulators of the Christ Spirit. So, I mean, we even see attributes coming from people that we can locate in secular history. Theodos is telling people to bring their possessions down to the river, right? That sounds a lot like Jesus in Matthew. I guess Mark too. The Egyptian is saying, I can knock down the walls. Well, every gospel has Jesus saying that, and he also is at the Mount of Olives. I mean, it's pretty hard to ignore the similarities here. And the fact that these gospels weren't written until at least 70 anyway, really is something to think about in those terms. My speculation is that the earliest Christians understood this. Cerinthus, the Ebionites, Carpocrates, Basilides, Saturninus, maybe Marcion. It was just part of the mystery. It was just part of what made... It was just an element of the Christian mystery. Christianity was a mystery cult. And the purpose of the mystery was to, one, preserve the Nazarene philosophy, which said that you have the Queen of Heaven as the city spirit, and you have her son as the temple spirit. And those things can exist and be encapsulated by leaders without actually being on earth. When you have Paul saying, don't you know that you're the temple and the Spirit is around you and in your midst? That's what he's talking about. He's a Nazarene. He's talking about the Nazarene philosophy. His version of it anyway. But we know that there are several layers to this mystery. There is, in Galatians 3:1, Paul says, it was in front of your own eyes. Christ was portrayed as being crucified. What does he mean by that? Well, it means that, like the Eleusinian mysteries, like other mystery cults, they had dramatic depictions of Jesus dying. That means that the dramatic depiction probably preceded Paul's letters. It also, I mean, you don't just do a dramatic depiction. You need some sort of level of proselytization too to get people to pay attention. So there's some sort of ministry that probably precedes that. But then you also have in 2 Corinthians 12 him talking about, oh, I'm going to boast in this guy who was taken to the third heaven 14 years ago. By the way, in Galatians, how long earlier was it that Paul met Cephas? It was 14 years, right? And so in 2 Corinthians 12, he said, 14 years ago, I knew a guy who was taken up to the third heaven and saw unspeakable things. Well, he's referencing Revelation. And I've made the case on my blog that I think Cephas and Cerinthus are the same person. And so if you believe me in my speculation that Cerinthus probably wrote Revelation, he at least used it, then Paul's referring to Cerinthus, right? Which means that Cerinthus was contemporary to Paul in the first century, maybe. Unless someone else wrote 2 Corinthians and Galatians, which I think 2 Corinthians and Galatians probably did have a different author than Romans, but anyway, I can't make that. I'm not going to argue that here, but that was the point. And so you've got this multi-tiered process of initiation that all these early Christians knew about, and there were all kinds of layers of understanding about who the high God was, who the demiurge was, and all these other things, and what the Christ actually meant, and what it meant to be the anointed one. But I think what happens is that in the 2nd century, starting in the mid-2nd century, you have people who say, the initiation layers are enough. We don't need more we don't need a deeper level of initiation where you need to go beyond Jesus was a human. That's why you start seeing in the mid-2nd century all these polemics against people who say that Jesus wasn't in the flesh, right? I mean, that's the whole point. That's what's going on here, I think. And so that's what we start seeing. I mean, perhaps it was out of political necessity. Justin Martyr in the mid-2nd century is complaining to the emperor, you're persecuting us, but you're not persecuting the Marcionites. 35 years later, Irenaeus is responding to Marcionite criticism that his sect is too friendly with Rome. Well, Irenaeus was pretty hostile to Marcion, and he was pretty hostile to Valentinus. So I guess we know who won, right? It was the people who, this is kind of a cynical reading on my part, but it was the people who saw that there was a way to get into bed with Rome. And all you need to do is shave off the deeper layers of the mystery. Pretty easy, right? So that's a pretty cynical reading on my part, but that's what I think happened, is I think that they took these metaphorical things, and it had been long enough, the religion had existed long enough that they didn't really need, maybe they didn't even know at that point, maybe Christianity was old enough that they didn't even know whether this Jesus guy existed or not. So I think that's what led into Christianity. That's how Christianity was invented and eventually adopted, is that you've got a singular story of a person who has all kinds of attributes assigned to him depending on which gospel you're reading. So that's what I think happened. That's how I think Jesus was invented, and that's why I don't think that Jesus as an individual person actually existed. So anyway, thanks for putting up with this for so long. Bye.